Uh, like I just mentioned a moment ago, this has been an interesting 6 months. And one of the first things that I noticed as I got into this period is that I didn't have the pressure of trying to get a lesson every Sunday. And it gave me an opportunity to do something a little bit different. You know what that was? To think about some of the things, to think about some of the things that we're actually doing. Oh, here comes the water. Oh, thank you. Wow. And one of the things I asked myself is, what are we doing I cannot open that. How'd you do that?
I'm Supergirl. according to my.
the top there, right there next to your purse.
Oh, yeah. Here, I'll just put it right here. My granddaughter says I'm Superwoman.
She evidently
I can hit a baseball too.
Well, what we're saying that we're doing in this class is studying Old Testament history. And I thought about that a little bit, and I also was watching the History Channel quite a bit at that time. And I realized what we are doing is not the sort of thing that we have on the History Channel. We're not really looking at too much history as you might expect in looking at this Old Testament in this fashion. So I wanted to find out a little bit about this whole idea of history, where it comes from and what it really means. And so what I did was to come up with a title, A History of History. Now, you may ask the question, what is this first part of the lesson got to do with the Bible? But you'll see in time. You notice when I started this, April the 20th, going into the history of history, almost immediately you're going to be told something. That history as we know it in the Western world starts with Homer. Homer was a poet, a Greek poet that lived approximately 700 to 800 BC in that period. What we're going to be talking about today centers very much about what we know in terms of history of the Western world. If you do watch the History Channel as I do, you'll find out there's an awful lot that goes on in India. There's a lot that goes on in China and in Japan. It's very interesting to find out how much influence the literature those folks had on so many people. But we're sticking pretty much with the Western world, and then you find out that Homer is regarded as the one that started the idea of recording history. How did he do that? Well, he wrote poems, and two of the most famous poems that he wrote were the Iliad and the Odyssey. And the Iliad and the Odyssey deal with a very definite period in the history of the Greeks. It deals with a war that existed approximately 400 or 500 years before Homer. A war that took place maybe around 1200 BC. I'm going to say BC. Homer wrote these things somewhere around 700 BC. A lot of time has passed. And what Homer does is to tell about these wars in terms of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Well, what are they? The Iliad is a story about the battle or the war that took place between the people in Sparta, which is a part of Greece, and the people in the city of Troy. We'll get to a map in just a moment to take a look at it. As it says here, it is usually considered that the Iliad is probably one of the best, considered one of the earliest works of the whole Western literary tradition. It's one of the best known and loved stories of all time. And I'm going to show you a few things about the Iliad in a few moments. What I'm going to point out right now is that there are certain personalities that show up that we want to mention. Among the Greeks is Agamemnon, Achilles, Odysseus, and Helen. With the Trojans, the only ones that we will encounter are Priam, who was the king of Troy, and his two sons, Hector and Paris. As I said, the Iliad deals with that war that took place between the people in Sparta and the people in Troy, Troy. All centered around Helen. Well, it says Helen of Troy here. Well, what is the story of Helen of Troy, and why is this such an important part of this whole story? You take a look at the story, we find out that Helen did not originate in Troy. She was from Sparta. Helen was from Sparta, and she was actually married to a man named Menelaus in Sparta. But as it happened, according to Homer now, all the gods had gotten together and had a great convention of some sort. And the question came out, who has the fairest of all the women? Who is the most beautiful of all the women? The contest finally settled down on Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. It'd be among those three. And it was decided, Zeus, you make the choice. Zeus was very astute. He realized that's not a good idea. He assigned somebody else to do it. And he asked this man Paris to do this. Paris was the son of the king of Troy at that time. Well, what happened is that these three ladies both worked on him to try to get Paris to favor them. As you read here that, I better get the other glasses on here. You find out that Athena offered skill in battle. Hera offered Europe and Asia. But Aphrodite came up with the best solution of all. She offered the love of the most beautiful woman on earth. That beautiful woman was Helen of Troy. Unfortunately, Helen of Troy lived in Sparta. Paris decided that he chose Aphrodite because he wanted Helen. And what we are told is that Paris did go down to Sparta and met Helen, and she immediately fell in love with him. And she left with him, and in essence what had happened, she was kidnapped and taken to Troy by Paris. Well, to say the very least, this had a tendency to anger certain people. Here's a map that shows you a little bit of where we're looking at, what we're looking at right now. Sparta is way down here in this part of Greece. Athens is up around here. Troy was on the western part of the peninsula that is Turkey, on the other side of the Aegean Sea. So they're not neighbors by any stretch of the imagination. If we take a look at the story that we have in the Iliad, it comes out very soon that one of the heroes of the story is a man named Achilles. Achilles was the champion warrior of the Greeks, of the Spartans. And Achilles becomes very famous, as you'll see as we go through the stories. Let us take a look at another slide here. Here's a picture of Achilles as a hero. And he was engaged in some very notable battles. One of these battles was with Hector. Now, I should also mention that most of this material that we're talking about all takes place in about the last week of the siege of Troy. The siege of Troy actually lasted about 10 years, but most of what we're seeing really took place in the last week. And one of the things was that Hector, who was a champion of the people in Troy, and who had made Achilles very unhappy because of a certain battle that Hector had been involved in, that Hector and Achilles go at each other and they fight to the death. They fight to the point where Achilles slays Hector. That is not surprising if you know a little bit about the background of Achilles. One of the background of Achilles that's pertinent here is that nobody was able to lay a sword on him. He never was wounded. There was no way that Hector was going to conquer him. Now the reason for this is that when Achilles was a baby, his mother Thetis took Achilles to the river Styx, and she dipped his body in the river Styx. I think we have a picture. Dipped his body in the river Styx, and wherever he had been wetted down by the water in the river, he was never going to be wounded again. But look at her very carefully. You notice that she's holding on to only part of Achilles. Actually, the only part she's holding on to is Achilles' heel. How many of you heard that expression, Achilles heel? This is where it comes from. What had happened in not being able to dip the heel into the water, Achilles had a vulnerable place on his body, namely his heel. And it happened also during this time, there's a little bit more on it, during this time, sort of a chance arrow coming namely from, of all people, Paris, happened to hit Achilles in the heel. And Achilles was wounded in the heel. We have a couple pictures of that wounding of Achilles in the heel. And Achilles suffers from this. He doesn't die in the battlefield, but the heel is infected and Achilles dies. And Achilles is finished. The Spartans, after laying siege for this 10 years, think maybe this will be a good time to get out of here. So they planned to leave, but they had an idea before they left that was rather interesting, that maybe we have one last hope, and that last hope was shown in this next slide. What they did is they constructed this big wooden horse. Have you heard of the Trojan horse before? Both of these are very familiar parts of the Western culture. And what happened is that a number of the soldiers, one of these soldiers that was put in the wooden horse was Odysseus, who we'll talk about in a few moments. They were put in the side of the horse. The horse was dragged inside the city gates. And when they closed the gates at night, that city horse with the soldiers on the inside was in the city. The soldiers came out, opened the gates, and guess what? The Greek army was there waiting for them and moved in, and they conquered Troy and destroyed it. They destroyed the destruction of Troy. It's done. It's finished. Is that the end of the story? Well, not really. There's another aspect to it. This is just stories, but we're going to ask the question later on, are these things that are really a part of history or not? The thing that's interesting is that one of the people that was in that horse was Odysseus. I think in the Latin he's called Ulysses, but we call him in the Greek, he's called Odysseus or Ulysses. He was a hero. He was a hero who, now that the war was over, could go back home to his wife Penelope, which he did, but it took him 10 years to do it. He spent 10 years in what is called the Odyssey. The Odyssey of Odysseus. The Odyssey was a matter of getting in his boat and traveling from one place to another place in the Mediterranean and seeing all these various and sundry things that he could encounter. Well, this in itself is a fantastic story. There are a lot of things that are recorded in the Odyssey, but I'm going to show you just a couple of them. One of the things, he came in the vicinity of an island where there were giants, big giants. Well, there are a lot of pictures of these giants. These giants would throw rocks down at the people in the boat. These giants are also different in that they had only one eye in their forehead. Sometimes they're referred to as a cyclops. And he, in his journeys, Ulysses had run into these. Another one that he ran into was the sirens. The sirens are very interesting also from a standpoint, because what they did is they stood on the shore, and when ships would go by, they tried to entice the sailors to come up, the soldiers to come up on the shore. Well, all you have to do is to take a look at this picture rather carefully. You find out when they did get enticed to the shore, they were killed. Here we see the skulls. You see the skulls down there. Here's a little better picture. And what happened is that Ulysses had found out about this and was very wary of getting anywhere near the island where these sirens were. But when he did have to go by it, he was very careful to see to it that nothing serious would happen. And what he did is he had himself tied to the mast of the ship so that he couldn't escape. And we were told that his sailors were not bothered, but because all of their ears were stuffed with wax, and therefore he was able to get by. Now, we've just taken a look at some parts of the Iliad and the Odyssey. This is a slide I just threw together. What was the depth of the study that we've had so far about the Odyssey and the Iliad? Of the literature of the Greek poet Homer, namely the Iliad and Odyssey, the amount that we've studied is about the same as the following as the study of the American Civil War. All right, here's our study of the American Civil War. The American Civil War is a conflict of the northern and southern states in the 1800s. Is there more to it in the Civil War than that? Yeah, an awful lot more. There's an awful lot more to the Iliad, and a lot more to the Odyssey that we're not going to get into. But as far as being pertinent in what we're looking at in our Sunday school lessons, what we have here is rather significant. Because at the time that Homer was writing these things, around 700 BC, there were other people that were writing about what was going on. I've got here a slide that simply says, this was the period in which the Old Testament stories were written. Those stories that we're going to talk quite a bit about. How many of them are written? Well, I got a number here, a lot of them, a real lot of them. Who wrote them? There are many, many writers. And the next slide, I think I find interesting, is a timeline of the writing period. Can you see that all right? I'll try to point out. The red line here is the timeline all the way from the time of about Abraham, which would have been about 1800 BC, all the way to around 400 BC. Now this era 400 becomes rather important in just a few moments. You'll notice that there was writing that was going on by the Hebrews that were living in Palestine throughout this whole period. Homer was writing only in this little one section, but there was a lot of writing that was happening by these Hebrews during that time. What did they write? Well, that's what we're going to do for the next 2 years. We're going to take a look at some of those stories and find out whether or not there might be some significance to these stories in terms of that word history. Now, the reason these stop at this point is that really was about the end of the writing that we have in the Old Testament that we can account for is taking place somewhere between 1000 BC, about the time of David, and about the time of Ezra, which would have been about 400 BC. What happens next is kind of interesting. We don't have anything in the Old Testament to speak of for about 400 years. About 400 years. Why? There were a lot of things that were going on in the world at that time, but there were not a lot of things that involved the people in Israel. It wasn't until the time of Christ that things come up again. But in other parts of the world, there were things that were taking place. Over in Greece, there was what we refer to as the classical period, the classical Greek period. The classical period is listed here as 450 BC to 350 BC. You can find a lot of various dates given for this. As a matter of fact, I think the next slide even shows one of these. The classical period of Greece is listed here as 525. How do we define the classical period of Greece? Because of things that had happened that had an effect on the whole world for a long time to come. This was the era of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. I looked up Socrates again today to make sure of something. Socrates died around 399 BC. It's very easy to remember when this classical period is if you think about Socrates. Socrates being the teacher of Plato. And Plato was the teacher of Aristotle. Aristotle was the teacher of guess whom? Alexander the Great. We find a succession all the way from Socrates. I'll get to these other two people in just a moment. There's an interesting thing I read about Socrates, and that if he had been at a major university today, he would have never gotten promoted. You know why? He never wrote a thing. There's nothing at all that we have that Socrates wrote. But on the other hand, Plato and some of his students wrote rather extensively about what Socrates had to say. Socrates is sometimes regarded as one of the really great thinkers of all time. Now you notice I have two other names here, and I put those in italics. They are Herodotus and Thucydides. Well, here are Sophocles and Euripides and Aristophanes. These are some of the people that also wrote some of the important material that came from that Greek classical period. And Archimedes a little bit later, but often regarded as one of the greatest mathematicians of all time. But as far as Herodotus and Thucydides, I have a problem with these names because I don't say them, I just read Thucydides. They are regarded as historians. Now, why are they regarded as historians? Because they looked at history differently from the way anybody else ever had done before. Very different, for example, from the way that Homer had recorded things in the Iliad. What Herodotus had done that was significant is that during the period that he was alive was also the period that the Persians, under Xerxes, were trying to get control of Greece. And we have what are called the Persian Wars. And what Herodotus did was wrote in great detail some things that went on in the battles of those wars. I mean really great detail, down to the number of people that would be involved in these battles, how many people were killed, where the battle took place, just exactly when the battle took place. Thucydides comes almost at the same time, just a little bit later. He also wrote about wars. He wrote about the Peloponnesian War, which was a civil war between the people in Sparta and the people in Greece. But he did the same thing that Herodotus had done. He wrote about it in what you might consider to be sort of a scientific way, very, very accurately. Here's a little bit about Herodotus. Herodotus is often regarded as being, as you see right down here, the father of history. The father of history because of the things that he had written concerning these wars. He got this title of father of history from a Roman by the name of Cicero, who was intrigued by the things that Herodotus had done. But there were people that questioned whether or not he really should deserve such a title because, well, let me tell you one place where he does. There is one of the battles that is described very vividly in Herodotus's works, and that was the battle at Thermopylae. Thermopylae was a battle where there were 300 Spartans that held off Xerxes' hordes of people of the Persian army. Here is the area, the Aegean Sea, where the Persians had been trying to get control of Greece. Thermopylae is somewhere right in this area here. Well, Thermopylae turned out to be just a very narrow pass. And what had happened is that a man by the name of Leonidas managed to get 300 of his Spartan soldiers to hold off that horde of these Persians. Even though every one of those Spartans was killed, they did hold the Persians back. And they often cite this battle of Thermopylae as being a turning point, you might say, in the conquest of the Persians trying to get control of Greece. As I wrote in this slide, just about everything that we know about this battle and about Leonidas comes from Herodotus. We don't have any other source other than Herodotus. I find that interesting when we take a look at another aspect of this battle, and that it became a part of a very big movie. This movie, called 300 Spartans, was about this battle at the Battle of Thermopylae battle. I was reading some of the reviews of this battle. One of the reviews, of this movie, one of the reviews said, a number of the reviews said that this was very close to being 90% accurate in terms of history. In other words, what we find is that way back at the time of Herodotus, he was writing history that even in contemporary times was regarded as being very reliable and resulted in this particular movie. Did any of you ever see this movie? I think I saw it. You remember seeing that? Yeah. This is about the 300 versions. But there was another problem with Herodotus. Herodotus has been criticized, it says here, because he made, excuse when you drink in public, what does that mean? It's going to go down the wrong throat. Herodotus was pretty free and easy with the pen. He was not at all afraid of including some of the Greek gods as a part of the story. And he would also embellish the stories with other tales that make the battle seem much more significant than it actually was. This was criticized by this man Thucydides, I'll say it. Thucydides was a man who was almost a contemporary of Herodotus, but writing about a different war. Why? Because Thucydides wrote in a very different style. Thucydides was the first one, you might say, that came up with what you might call scientific history. Not only did he record these battles very accurately in the same way as Herodotus, but he also did other things to make the work a little bit different. Well, not a little bit different, very different. One of the things that Thucydides did was indicate that all of these things were taking place here on Earth, these battles and all these different events, were not something that was responsible from the gods, the Greek gods, but man himself was responsible for these things. Man was the creator of these incidents, and he would write the history not including the divinities in any way whatsoever, but he did go rather far in including the importance of individual and the individual people in what had actually happened. This was very different in a sense from the way that Herodotus was writing. As I said down at the bottom, Thucydides regards history as being caused by the choices and actions of human beings. That's kind of a significant thing to say at the very least. One of the things that was very interesting that Thucydides did was to make us feel that the people that were involved were really involved, is to include quotations from these people in his writing. He would actually put them in quotation marks. This is what so-and-so said at this time. So we're seeing what the person actually thought at that particular time. He puts them in quotation marks, and I think what is said here is the following. It should be noted that very often it may be nothing more than the gist of what the person said, and maybe even what he ought to have said. It's a little bit hard to say, but he was not invoking the gods. His type of history was very different, to say the very least. This Thucydides was also a very clever guy. I tried to look up some quotations, and I had some very good quotations that I was going to include, and I lost them. But I did find a couple of others. it's interesting to take a look at these particular quotations. There are hundreds of them, and if you go to the internet and look up Thucydides and look up quotations, you can see some of the things that this man said. I think that one of the things, the bottom one I find kind of interesting. In democracy, someone who fails to get elected to office can always console himself with the thought there was something not quite fair about it. Have you ever heard that before?
You mean we didn't invent that?
What are we hearing right now, even before
Same
the
thing.
election? I think the other one I include, most people in fact will not take trouble of finding out what the truth is, but are very much more inclined to accept the first story they hear. Why do you think the politicians are out on the stump right now? For this very, very, very clever man. An interesting comparison was made at the time between Herodotus and Thucydides. And what was factual was not showing up that often in certain parts of Herodotus. And there was a tendency to regard Herodotus not as the first historian, but as the first liar. And probably that we should look at Thucydides a little bit more carefully in terms of whether or not we're looking at something that we might today call history. Well, let's take a look at the next slide. If we take a look at the sources of Homer's poems and Old Testament history, we find that both Homer's poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and essentially all of the Old Testament history takes place and is written down before the classical period, before Herodotus or Thucydides even come on the scene. We don't have anything in the Old Testament that we could refer to as being influenced by these historians that came out of the classical period. What is the consequence of that? There's that line again. We can ask this question: are the Homer poems an Old Testament history? If we use only this conclusion that we're going to have to use as a criteria, what we have from Herodotus and Thucydides, we're going to say they don't meet the standard. We can't really regard them as history in that light. They cannot be regarded as history. Now, I'm going to change things just a little bit here. Give you a couple of facts that I find very interesting. If we take a look at the time of Thucydides and Homer, approximately 400 BC, and the conclusion that we've just reached about Homer's poems and about the Old Testament history, we're not going to have any history to speak of through the period of the Persians, of the Greeks, followed by the Romans, followed by the Dark Ages, followed by medieval history, followed by the Renaissance, and followed by the period of Enlightenment all the way up to around 1600. We're going to look at a period of almost 2,000 years where the best that we can do as far as the Iliad and as far as the Old Testament history is concerned, say, hey, these are great stories, but they are not necessarily history. And we should not consider them as being history. Well, why did we stop in the middle of the 1800s? Because something rather significant happened about that time. This was the beginning of a new discipline, a discipline that had not really existed as far as the Western world was concerned, the discipline of archaeology. Archaeology comes on the scene. Now, I'm going to give a little bit of the history of archaeology that's pertinent to what we're looking at right now, just a little bit. There's a lot more, but the things that are pertinent right now may be a little bit out of chronological order. Part of the reason is because with something new like this, there is a tendency very often for the press to get involved and maybe blow something up to be more important than it should be. One of the things that got blown up was Heinrich Schliemann. I remember one time in this class many years ago, not here actually, it was at the Manor, somebody immediately said, oh, even before I had Schliemann's name up there, said, oh, Schliemann was the one that invented archaeology. Well, he is, by many people, considered to be the father of certain parts of archaeology. But when we take a look at the whole story, we find out there were a lot of other things that were happening I'll get into in just a moment. But the thing about Schliemann that was interesting is that he, as an individual, did some interesting things. One of the things, he made himself a fortune as an industrialist, and he was a very wealthy man. And when he was still comparatively young, he took it upon himself to do what? Travel around and learn as much as he possibly could. Another thing is that this Schliemann, from the time he was about 8 or 9 years old, was introduced to the Iliad and read about the things that Homer had written in the Iliad, and probably got to know the stories in the Iliad very thoroughly. And Schliemann took it upon himself at one point to try to find out whether or not the city of Troy might have actually existed. If the city of Troy existed, then maybe we can take a look at the things that we have in the Iliad and that we have in the Odyssey as being related to something that had really happened. And that when Homer was writing about these things, he was writing about things that were a part of the legend of the people that lived at that particular time. Actually, here's a picture of Schliemann. What we find out is that we know the date when Schliemann made his really great discovery. They were digging around when he came across something that turned out to be a pot of gold. Digging around where? In a place that somebody else had told him might be Troy, and digging around there where it might be worth looking at. Schliemann was really not the real discoverer. He was the first one to shovel over some dirt and come up with the gold. But he got all the publicity, and it wasn't too long before his name was rather prominent in a lot of European circles as being the discoverer of the city of Troy and the instigator of this discipline of archaeology. Whoops. As a matter of fact, here is a book that was written all about Priam's gold. The gold that he had found was the treasure chest of Priam. Actually, I think it's mentioned here that the guy that's really probably responsible is this guy, Huyser and Calvert. They really should be regarded as the discoverers, but Schliemann gets all the credit. Did he make use of it? Oh yes, in the biggest way. He had pictures of himself busily excavating Troy. Here's a picture, keep that picture in mind. Another picture of the excavation of the Troy in this fashion. And then we find that what he had done is taken some of the treasures that came from the Troy, and he decked his wife with some of the gold that came from the Troy. This did not go over too well with some of the public. I don't read the German that well, but this is really talking about the shame that he was bringing on Priam by taking that gold, which had lain there for just about 2,000 years. And so Schliemann gets criticized, probably quite justly by some people, but still he is regarded as the father of modern archaeology. Well, that's nonsense, because we find out that biblical archaeology really got started even before that. Probably the first person that we can cite as being involved in biblical archaeology is Edward Robinson. How am I doing in time, by the way?
You're fine.
Edward Robinson was a retired professor from I'll say it, from a theological seminary. And he, with a student of his or a friend of his, decided to find out something about Palestine, and that is to make a walking tour through Palestine and find out if any of those cities that were in Palestine might be the same cities that are mentioned in the Old Testament. Well, you say, well, why not? Go take a look at this. Oh, think about this. The Jews were driven out of Palestine 125 BC by the Roman Emperor Hadrian. There were still some Jews living in Palestine, but for the most part, the Jews had long gone. There were probably still a few Jews that were still living there. And what happened is a lot of people from the neighboring Arabian peoples moved into Palestine, settled in these cities, and probably gave these cities Arabian names. What we find out that what Robinson had done is to very carefully make some measurements and making use of a compass, and was able to designate where some of these cities, which were now regarded as Arabian cities, might have actually been the cities that are designated in the Old Testament. There's a picture of him. He wrote a book. I think this book came out around 1850. You know, this is about 20 years before Schliemann. He wrote a book describing all of these places. I think the next slide I found quite interesting because of the names that are here. One of the names that's mentioned here is Nelson Gluck, who was a very important, almost contemporary archaeologist. He's, as a matter of fact, we might get to sometime talking about Nelson Gluck, and I'll point out why he had his picture on the cover of Time magazine. And Nelson Gluck's writings are compared by, I'll find it, by Ernest Wright, who was one of the real pioneers in biblical archaeology, saying that Nelson Gluck's writing about the geography of that period was almost as good as Edward Robinson, who had written 100 years before, indicating that what Robinson had done was probably rather accurate and also rather significant. What happened after all the publicity that Schliemann had gotten? There was a lot more interest in biblical archaeology. That is, going out and looking for things of biblical interest, largely led by American and British archaeologists. We're going to be talking about some of these archaeologists to some extent sometime later in the course of the year. But two of the important ones, well, one of them is this Ernest Wright that I just mentioned, and William Albright. They were really the significant pioneers that were getting the whole idea of biblical archaeology going. But it's kind of interesting to take a look at what archaeology might actually involve. That earlier picture I told you to remember showed these archaeologists like Schliemann wearing bowler hats and overcoats. That's the way they performed their archaeology. It wasn't long before we find out the archaeologists had to have shovels and picks to be able to get at this stuff. By the end of the 1800s, that had changed, and they were getting very careful, and they were actually using camel hair brushes. One of the reasons for this is that it took a while for archaeologists or people that were involved in this to realize there was something very significant about archaeology in comparison to a lot of the other disciplines. I was educated in an experimental discipline in chemistry. And one of the things that happens in chemistry quite often, you're on the trail of something you think is rather significant, and something goes wrong, and guess what? You have to start all over again. And I think most of us that are involved in experimental sciences know what it's like to have to start over. Guess what? There are no start overs in archaeology. You get one crack the first time, because once what the thing has been discovered, it no longer is going to be ancient. It's going to be dependent very much on who was the last person that looked at it. It became very necessary during the 1800s for the development of techniques for doing things when they came across some archaeological digs to see to it that they did not destroy anything. And by the beginning of World War II, we have a number of archaeologists behaving very carefully at these digs and making sure that nothing is lost. It's kind of interesting to take a look at archaeology since that time. Since World War II, we find that there are a lot of other things. Nowadays, archaeologists go around with something that looks like a lawnmower. It's not. It's an underground radar. It's an underground radar. It's an instrument which you can go over the ground and detect whether there's something underneath the ground. Very interesting piece that was shown on the History Channel not too long ago about when they take a look at Stonehenge, they find out on the outside of Stonehenge is another great big circle of rocks that have all been detected with this underground radar. Actually, it goes a little bit further than that. They're actually using satellite imaging to get an idea of what the landscape might look like, because you can see differences in the landscape as to where there might be things that are underneath the ground. And I find this next one rather interesting. This is what a carbon-14 data equipment looks like today. Great big mass spectrometers that are analyzed. I had another picture, which I cannot find, that has a whole room full of these mass spectrometers. The reason I find this rather interesting, I was at the University of Chicago as a graduate student at the time that Libby was doing this work on carbon-14 and making this rather significant contribution to archaeology. And I would go by his lab, and there were little stacks of bricks that were stacked up. Stacks of bricks that had built a little house inside where they would put things that were not going to be influenced by any outside radiation. And in that way he was actually able to come up with rather archaic means of determining the age of things through carbon-14. I won't go into the chemistry of carbon-14, but it happens to be a radioactive element that has a very definite half-life of maybe about 3,000 or 4,000 years. And if something has been alive at one time, it very likely was taking in carbon-14 at a pretty steady rate, because carbon-14 is generated by neutrons that are coming from outside the planet. And anybody that eats anything that had been vegetable at one time is going to have carbon-14 in it. If you have that carbon-14, it's going to be constantly irradiated. If it dies, guess what? You don't take on any more. And you can find out just how long the thing that you're looking at had, since it had died, because of how much carbon-14 was left. A very, very significant contribution to what we have in archaeology today. What kind of information do we actually get from the archaeology? Well, probably the most significant in some regards is the literature that is found. You'll see this when we go through this in the next couple of months, that some of the literature that has been discovered by the archaeologists tell us an awful lot about what? About secular history, about the history at the time that these people were living. Then the question comes up, of course, does that secular history show up in any of the things that we have in the Old Testament? Well, we'll talk about that when we come to it. But not only the literature, but also, and by the way, I'll talk about some of the specific literature later too. We're also picking up artifacts that are things that were made by man, and you can learn something about it. Among the things that they find are also very interesting are things that have religious significance, things that they find where there might have been temples and things of this sort. These are artifacts. Anything that would indicate that it had been made by man. I find it kind of interesting to say that these are mundane and deal with everyday life, because you know where they find most of these things that were part of the mundane life. And the one thing that all humans have in common, and what was that? They die, and they're put in the tombs. And a lot of very, very valuable information has been gathered from the tombs of people by the archaeologists. They give us some indication of what things were like at the time that these things were made. What has archaeology accomplished? Although based on legends, both oral and written, Homer's poems and Old Testament stories have some elements of historicity. By the way, historicity is a word, I looked it up.
Good to
There
know.
are elements of history. That's one of the things that we're going to be looking at, in looking at what we know about the history of a certain period and how some of these things are actually reflected in what? In the stories that are told. Without trying to say anything about secular history, but we see there's evidence that the secular history must have played a role. All of a sudden, what does this do? This has made the Old Testament stories a source of biblical history. By looking at what we have in these stories, maybe we can gain something about the history of the people that lived at that time. Even though we can't ascribe it as being scientific history, it does have I'll say it. Now, if you give me about 10 more minutes, I want to show you something else that I found that fascinated me. Is that turning to the New Testament, we find out that the New Testament does not have any Bible stories. There are no Bible stories. The New Testament is almost all what? Scientific history. Very, very carefully outlined science. You take a look at the New Testament, there are things that are very peculiar about it. For one thing, it covers, in contrast to the Old Testament, which goes from the beginning of time all the way to the birth of Christ. The New Testament covers a period from maybe about 7 BC to maybe about 68 or 69 AD. A period of maybe 70, 75 years, not much more than that. And essentially all of the material that we have in the New Testament, guess what? It was written in Greek. And we find that Greek had become very influential in determining what the people were thinking at that time. And when they were writing about this Jesus, about this new religion, it was all written in Greek. This is why people that are in the seminary take a course in Greek, because they can read some of the original material of the New Testament. I'm going to give you an indication of why we say there is no Bible stories. Because Bible stories are generally going to be based on what? They're going to be based on legends. Some of these Bible stories are going to be based on legends that were orally transmitted probably for several centuries. If you were to take a look at a real historical figure, very often, very important historical figures have something in common. For example, George Washington. You will accept him as a historical figure. What do you know about the boyhood of George Washington? Practically nothing. Oh, wait a minute. You do have the story of chopping down the cherry tree. But that just may be a story. Other than that, I don't know anything about George Washington. If the birth of Christ had been a part of a Bible story and based on legend, the birth of Christ would probably have started out with, once upon a time, Joseph took Mary and went to Bethlehem, and that's where Jesus was born. Does anybody remember how the birth of Christ is? How about this? In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census would be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census, and it took place when Quirinius was governor. And everyone went to his own town, and Joseph took Mary and went from Nazareth, which was in Galilee, to Bethlehem to register. What do we have here about the birth of Christ? Who, what, where, when, why? All questions you might ask about the birth of Christ, they are listed here. The only thing that's not listed here I found kind of interesting, it doesn't say anything about how. That comes a little bit later. whoops. Oh, I guess I haven't got it there. Actually, I did find a little bit of how Mary got there. Does anybody remember? Sitting on a donkey. Every one of the pictures I could find of Joseph taking Mary to Bethlehem, she is sitting on a donkey. Why? She's pregnant. She's pregnant. But think about how carefully even that birth of Christ is all. Now, you say about Jesus Christ. What do you know about the youth? What do you know about Jesus Christ from the time that he was born until when? Until he was baptized. Oh, we know two things. We know that when he was 8 days old, he was taken to the temple by his mother and father for his baptism. And two people are mentioned in that story. The story is in the book of Luke. It talks about Anna, it talks about Simeon, and recognize this new baby as being something special. And then we have another story where we find that Jesus was in the temple at the age of 12. Now, why do we know these stories? Because there's every indication in the world that Luke, this historian, had actually talked with Mary and had gotten information from Mary. If you go to the Gospels, you'll find out that Luke is the only one that tells us any of the details of Jesus being born in a stable and lying in a manger. Oh, you get the story of the three wise men, but that's a little bit later. But Luke is the only one that mentioned. Luke also is the one that mentions coming to the temple as a child of 8 days, of coming to the temple when he was 12 years old. And there's every reason to believe that Luke probably had actually communicated with Jesus' mother to get this information to include in his gospel when he wrote it. One of the reasons for thinking that is something that is written about Mary, that Mary looked at these things concerning the birth and concerning the christening or the circumcision, concerning the visit of the temple, that she pondered these in her heart. Does that sound familiar? She treasured these things. There's only one person that could have told Luke that Mary treasured these things in her heart. And who would that person be? Mary. Here we have some very good evidence of what had happened. Now, from the time that Jesus is a child, is a baby, except for that period in the temple, we have a period of about 30 to 33 years where we know absolutely nothing about Jesus. One of the things that we can surmise is that he lived in Nazareth, that he may have worked with his father Joseph as a carpenter. We don't really know. It isn't until he's baptized by John. That's an awful lot. Then we start to learn about Jesus. I came across something many years ago, and I tried hard to find another reference to this. I was told that actually the number of days that we can account for in Jesus' life is rather limited. The figure that I saw was 87. I could not find that figure anywhere. And so during this period that we had, I tried to find out a little bit more and found out I was way off. The number is 51 or 52. We know so little about Jesus' life that if of the 37 or 38 years that he may have been alive on this earth, we can only account for maybe about 50 of those days. Some of those are given up there already in the birth and in what we have at the temple. But where do the rest come? They come from what we have in the Gospels. Oh, there's that. I told you I had a picture. These are things that she treasured in her heart. I didn't realize I had all this material here. One of the things that was very significant about the histories that were written by Thucydides was that he liked to quote people. He liked to quote them as to this is exactly what they said. What we find in the New Testament, in Luke, for example, and I'll say something about John in a moment, that Luke tells us about the Sermon on the Mount. Seeing crowds, he went up on the mountain, And we sat down, his disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth saying, well, there's on the mouth. Well, I did not do this right. Yeah, I guess I did. You notice the quotation marks? Quotation marks were written about, quotation marks were given for all the things that were said on the Sermon on the Mount. It was not just the Beatitudes, those we're familiar with. Actually, the Sermon on the Mount runs almost to the end of chapter 7. And what we find in that Sermon on the Mount, a lot of things that are very pertinent to the gospel, toward the gospel and the teachings of Jesus. Here are a couple that are included here that I think are rather interesting. There is a statement that says, "Think not that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill them." This is something that we want to look at when we're looking at the life of Christ. This one also is very important. "For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." You're going to hear a lot more about that in the next few months when we talk about the history of the Jews, how intent they were in trying to follow the law. And when he had finished saying these things, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he taught as one who had authority and not as the scribes. Go to the Gospel of John. Just page through this, and you'll find out the Gospel of John, written by somebody who was a close associate of Jesus, has a lot of the conversations that Jesus had with his disciples. Very often you will find the disciples asking such and such. And then it doesn't say that Jesus taught this. It says that Jesus then said the following. And they get some more direct quotations of what Jesus said. Strictly after what? After the sort of thing that we have in the histories of Thucydides. Whoever was writing these was very careful to follow the stuff. What about Palm Sunday? What about the Holy Week? What you're going to see right now is a condensation of approximately 140 slides. We learn so much about Holy Week. I'm going through them very quickly. I'm giving you a day by day of everything that happened to Jesus during Holy Week in some very great detail that indicates somebody was there to witness these things all the way to the time of the burial and the resurrection. And at the time of the resurrection, we're even given the names of some of the people who were there. A lot of information that we have in the gospel concerning Jesus, information indicating that it was written following the style of Sidney. Luke wrote something else. He wrote the Acts of the Apostles. I'm not going to be able to abbreviate this too much, and I'm going to abbreviate it a whole lot, as a matter of fact. Very often people have cited the Acts of the Apostles, which were written by this Greek, Luke, as being one of the best examples of ancient literature that we're going to find. We get the story of the beginning of the church, namely the time of Passover, in terms of the time and the place and what had actually happened, about the early days of the church, like the story of Stephen, about the conversion of Paul, about Paul's many journeys. These things are all listed in great detail, even down to the last part of what we have in the book of Acts concerning Paul's journey to Rome to be tried by the emperor, and they encounter a storm at sea. These are the things that I said I abbreviated. They encounter a storm at sea. That chapter 27 of Acts is often regarded as one of the best descriptions of a storm at sea in all of ancient literature. The New Testament is very different. The New Testament is very different not only in terms of the context, but also in the way that it was written. Our interest, however, in this class is going to be what? Going back to the Old Testament. And what can we learn from those stories that we have in the Old Testament about what is really the history of the people at that time? Next week, we're going to talk about that. namely the types of the stories, and how this Old Testament was put together. As I indicated, there might have been many, many different writers writing over a period of almost 600 years. And all of this is going to be combined into one place, into one book. And we're going to talk about the compilation of the Old Testament and how it is that we have these stories and can actually learn something about where they came from. So next week we'll talk about the compilation of the Old Testament, as well as look a little bit more carefully at what is the nature of the stories that we have in the Old Testament, as well as the stories that we have in the Iliad and in the Odyssey, and what makes them stories that lasted thousands of years and we still read with interest. What did I usually say at the end of a period? The end.
Very good.